Whenever a new safety device comes along, the reaction is always the same. First comes an overwhelming negative reaction from the majority, followed swiftly by a smaller group of voices insisting they rather like it, and inevitably invoking something like Formula One's halo as the clinching argument. That script is as predictable as it is tedious. Over time, the new thing becomes the new normal, and the cycle continues. But really, this all comes down to a more fundamental question. What do we define a car as? For my part, the latest FIA devices called the anti-launch whatevers. I'm just getting a bit tired of all this, to be honest with you. Is probably a step too far for me. I don't say that from a position of deep emotional investment, because truthfully, I've kind of checked out of the modern karting scene, and I have for quite some time, as many adults have who've been involved with the sport for a long time. What I talk about here is more from the perspective of a detached observer, mildly entertained by how a sport can mutate, deform, and eventually sort of lose coherence. To me, karting as a motorsport with a robust identity is pretty much gone, something of the past. I now prefer to call what we have now, for the most part at least, Formula 5. A label that feels far more honest about its current trajectory. Now, what do I mean by Formula 5? It's one of those things that I know it when I see it, but really it just contextualises karting purely as a stepping stone to cars, as a place to find talent for the future, not as a sport that has its own identity, its own history. For me, karting sort of has gone in the wrong direction. I call myself a bit of a karting historian, and I don't think much history is being created in today's scene. Now, I digress. So, whenever someone comes out in support of the latest safety contraption, the natural follow-up question is, where do we stop? Where is a point at which you finally say, that's enough, that's just about right? Few people ever actually answer that, and in the absence of limits, safetyism, once accepted as an ideology, quickly becomes a slippery slope where you are obliged to kind of accept every single new device that's put forward. Karting is especially vulnerable to this because it's remarkably easier to propose plausible safety improvements. Piece by piece they add up. Before long, you've constructed something that doesn't really resemble a kart at all. No other motorsport really has transformed from what it was at its inception. So of course, one has to consider the changing demographics of karting. Once upon a time, karting was primarily an adult activity. Today it's overwhelmingly child-based, and that alters the psychology around the sport dramatically. Promotion changes, presentation changes, and most critically, safety expectations change. It's very difficult to sustain the idea that a bit of danger is fine when you're dealing with literally children. So with each generational shift within the sport, resistance to change erodes further. We have such a high turnover of parents that memories and attachments to certain philosophical ideas really mean little. And this is why I've come to what some might consider an extreme conclusion, that karting as we know it, as we knew it, has kind of ceased to exist. Incrementality can get you there without anyone really formally deciding it or even observing it. Personally, I've never had any issue from a safety perspective with any era of kart. My safety concerns generally are about whether someone's educated on the risks that they're taking, or whether people are standing at the side of the circuit and that kind of thing, sort of things that don't really add anything to the sport. And I wouldn't blink at returning to 1956, 1965, 1970, 1990, and compare it to motocross, a motorsport that is dangerous by any reasonable standard, especially compared to kart racing. Yet the motorcycle itself has barely changed since its inception. The injuries are part of the package, but the sport kind of endures. Now, some may feel uncomfortable with that, but it's just a reality of motorbike racing. That's not to say I'm going to object to any safety improvements, but everything's a balance, and whether you are changing the core philosophy of something in exchange for safety is kind of where I personally draw the line. Now imagine transplanting motocross injury rates into karting. Overnight the activity would be banned outright. Yet somehow motocross survives, relatively untouched, while karting ties itself into knots of protective plastic that I think tells you everything about perception, culture, and what people are willing to tolerate depending on the story that they've been told and the culture that they're a part of. I don't for one second see that these new rear wheel covers, roller things, whatever branding they eventually acquire is the end point. They're merely the part of an incremental but continuous process. The FIA already has a homologation for high back seats, They've never been mandated for traditional competition. The backlash at the time was quite substantial. But it doesn't take much imagination to see where Formula 5 is heading next. Karting has had a handful of close calls in recent years which have captured attention. At Kartmasters, a young driver punctured their lung. At an FIA event recently, another driver lost a helmet while a kart was going over their head. Thankfully, both escaped with recoverable injuries. Conversations will now inevitably move on to the next intervention. When you're dealing primarily with children, the tolerance for risk drops to near zero. I certainly can understand that, don't get me wrong. In recent years, contact rugby for children has become a contentious issue. There have been calls for it to be banned completely. Unlike rugby, karting can't forcibly divorce the senior and the junior categories in terms of actual risk profile. What a child faces from a risk perspective in a kart is pretty much the same as what the adult division faces in terms of whatever safety devices are in play at the time. So we're now moving into an era where almost any accident risk becomes unacceptable by definition. From that perspective, additional bodywork, thicker, more advanced crash structures, roll bars, seatbelts, speed restrictions, none of this is actually off the table, because once the safetiest mindset is accepted as the governing ideology, there's no logical reason to resist any of these being implemented. It's worth noting that many of the most serious accidents I've personally witnessed haven't been in proper competition but in rental karts. The issue is that once you combine full wraparound bodywork, if that is the next intervention, nothing would surprise me. With the speeds that modern karts are capable of, then the potential for quite enormous crashes is quite self-evident. And this raises a thornier problem. If the governing ideology is safetyism, then someone will naturally conclude that having drivers exposed, able to exit the seat freely, is no longer acceptable. From that point on, the logic of enclosures, roll cages, or cockpit structures becomes irresistible. Once you've crossed that threshold, you're not talking about a car anymore. You're effectively talking about a shrunken single-seater or just a mini car. Cost, often the line of final resistance, is a weak argument. Karts have already ballooned in price thanks to bodywork, homologation cycles, and above-inflation pricing increases, just full stop. Many of these safety improvements are far from budget-friendly, yet they are pushed through all the same. That precedent has already been set. It's not even unprecedented to have karts, in inverted commas, with full rollover bar and hands protection. Ninja karts in the UK run to these sort of regulations on short ovals, and these could easily be refined for FIA competition. Now, I'm not completely clued up on the risks involved in these karts. I'm sure that they introduced a whole other sort of slew of issues, but the direction of travel here is quite obvious. Formula 5 will have to keep layering on structures, protections and restrictions until what remains is no longer visibly or recognisably a kart in any meaningful sense of the word. I would argue to some extent we've already passed that point. And this is where I kind of have to admit defeat. I can't logically argue against this trajectory. If we accept the premise that the scenarios that these new devices are designed to prevent are intolerable, we must accept the cascade of further measures that will naturally follow. Once you've said yes to this ideology, you've already lost the ability to say no later. So I'll end with this, and with the only real question that matters. What level of risk should children in Formula 5, be exposed to? Because unless someone is willing to give a clear, coherent answer, the slope remains infinite. My suspicion is that even with these new devices, there is no robust argument against going much, much further. And if that doesn't reduce risk to zero, what next? How can we justify children racing at all? It's an interesting question to ask. Thanks for watching. Bye.